Calm down. Very glad that you're all engaged and having interesting conversations. Okay, so we are delighted to start the second half of today with a keynote from Michael Kremer. Michael is the university professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Chicago. He is a 2019 co-recipient of the Nobel Prize in Economics. He's a recipient of a MacArthur Fellowship and a Presidential Faculty Fellowship. He was named a Young Global Leader by the World Economic Forum. At the University of Chicago, he directs the Development Innovation Lab, and his work focuses on on innovation, including in education, health, water, finance, and agriculture in developing countries. He's written many papers around incentives around innovation, including on patent buyouts, advanced market commitments, and approaches to funding social innovation. Michael himself is an innovator and a social entrepreneur, and he remains very active in translating his academic work into programs that have impacted the lives of many millions of people around the world. His work on advanced market commitments for vaccines was instrumental in the development of a new pneumococcal vaccine, tackling a leading cause of infant morbidity and mortality. Michael is a co-founder of the USAID's Development Innovation Ventures Lab, which is an open-tiered, evidence-based fund that supports innovation for development. And today he's going to talk to us about lessons from USAID's Development Innovation Lab. So Michael, thank you so much, and we're looking forward to your talk.
Thank you so much. Great. Industrial policy is controversial among some economists, perhaps not least at my new institution, University of Chicago. But there's widespread agreement that markets for innovation are rife with market failures. And then for some particular types of innovation, those market failures might be particularly extreme. So, for example, innovations on ways to manufacture that emit less greenhouse gases, for example. That's going to not only do you have all the market failures associated with innovation, but you have all the market failures associated with externalities and global public good externalities at that. Another example would be innovations to find new uses for off-patent drugs, generic drugs. That's a more classic innovation failure that sometimes it's hard to, if you want to run trials on that costs money. You're not going to be able to protect that from followers. I would argue innovation and delivery of government services might be another case. There's a monopsony buyer. It's going to be hard of the new technique that you develop. It might be hard to recover the costs of it. So I think even for those who are skeptical of industrial policy in general, they might be open to more narrowly tailored approaches that focus on innovation and maybe on particular areas of innovation where the market might not deliver enough for particular reasons in that sector as well. So what I'd like to discuss today is evidence from a particular program, Development Innovation Ventures, which is, as was explained, I was involved in helping set this up within USAID, and I'm still involved with it. I'm scientific director, so I'm not a neutral party, so let me disclose that. But Development Innovation Ventures invests in innovation aimed at promoting development in low and middle income countries. So you could argue about whether that's also a special case where there's particular incentives are particularly weak for innovation. There's a clicker. Great. So let me start off with that background for this conference. Let me tell you another. Here's maybe my more standard introduction, which is there's a a very big movement going on across multiple areas to invest more in innovation for in social areas. And one type of this has been around for a long time, and it's we have a lot of evidence on, which is scientific R&D. So there's a big literature on the evaluating, going back to Zvi Griliches or others, going back on looking at the rate of return to this investment. And the numbers that they come up with are very high, 50, 70% rates of return to public sector R&D are not unusual estimates. But what I'll focus on today is two other categories, and these are the areas where Development Innovation Ventures invest, which is social science R&D, so including randomized trials of the type that I've been involved with a lot, and some people in this room are involved with, a lot of development economists use that technique. The World Bank, I've just put as an example of a funder of that type of work. And a third type is impact investing or social entrepreneurship. So there, I'll put a Midyar Network or the Skoll Foundation. There are lots of, I don't know about here in Columbia, but a lot of people in a lot of business schools run competitions, and there are people who are interested in social entrepreneurship, and this is an active field as well. So I think there's, what's the rate of return to those investments? Are they good investments? I think there's been some public discussion of that. We're going to try and make some progress relative to a lot of the existing public discussion. I don't know whether, we're quite at the level of, we can only get so far, but I think we may make some progress relative to some existing discussion. I think, let me characterize the existing discussion on this, perhaps not totally fairly. I think there's a lot of, advocates of this sort of thing talk about success stories. Critics talk about examples of failure. There's a bunch of examples of each. And then you get some people who do counts. And the counts often don't look very good. There's more failures when you try and count them than there are successes. If you look at, what fraction of RCTs wound up scaling up if they're looking at something innovative. Or if you can argue that's a very impoverished way of looking at it, and we should think about what we learn in terms of social science. But if you're, putting on the, did this program scale, more often than not, they don't scale if it's in an innovative new program. Or if you're looking at, for every successful social entrepreneurship idea, there are many that don't succeed. Okay. So I would say that's I don't think there's a resolution of this. There's some, but that's the type of analysis people have done. There's also questions. Development Innovation Ventures is a funder, and partly. I was interested in, are there any lessons you can draw from this about how to structure funding systems for this? And, there's a lot. Development Innovation Ventures funds both the sort of social science research, if you want to call it that, and it acts like an impact investor in some ways. And, there's a lot of people say, well, you should try and be like a venture capital, act like a venture capitalist. That's sort of the sort of the state of the art. That's a good practice. So I'm going to argue a little bit that maybe you should think about complementing venture capital. Oh, I should say, so work in progress with Sasha Gallant, Olga Rostopchova, and Milan Thomas. We have a work in progress on this, and this talk will reflect that a lot, but also some other things. I'll also talk a bit about. It also draws on some work with Esther Duflo that we did further back. Okay. Sorry. Let me describe the program. So it's very open. I'm going to also note some ways in which it actually differs from what's often thought of as best practice. I'll say that I'm going to describe the program as it was. The program's been around just about a dozen years. So I'll describe the program during the first 2 years, 2010 through 12, because we're going to try and look at the portfolio in those years and analyze that portfolio to see if we can come up with any results to learn empirically from it. So the program was open across sectors, open across countries. When I say sectors, education, health, agriculture, microfinance, commercial. It's also open on commercial and public sector scale. That's highly unusual. There are lots of competitions to fund, business ideas or nonprofit business ideas, but still ones that are supposed to be financially bring in as much revenue as the money going out. And then there's lots of other funders who fund randomized controlled trials of ideas for the public sector, but we funded both. So very open. In a way, that's pretty unusual because there's lots of, I think a more standard way that at least in international development funders work is they pick something and they say we're going to fund in the sector, this is a priority. USAID, reading by grade 3 was a priority. People in the education sector figured you can't do much else unless you learn to read by grade 3. A lot of kids aren't reading by grade 3. We're going to focus on that. And that's not unreasonable, but maybe there's some other things that, maybe there's a great idea for grade 4 or for math. And so we wanted to be open. Okay? So in some ways I would argue that there might be one possible virtue of this program is that if you think that inside the bureaucracy you're not going to come up with all the good ideas, it's nice to have sort of an open window to complement that. And this is a quite relatively small program within the agency. Okay? But then if you're going to be open in all these dimensions, how do you make decisions? So we had this 3-level process, this tiered funding process, where the tiering was very much based on evidence, or at least so we had small grants for piloting. All of these numbers, when I hear about some other things in this conference, these are absurdly small numbers, but grants of up to $100,000 for piloting ideas. Grants for testing, when we started, this was up to $1 million. It's pretty clear, in case of things that would be scale up through the public sector, this was supposed to be, to demonstrate impact and cost effectiveness rigorously, not necessarily with a randomized controlled trial, but that was what was typically proposed. For things that were going to scale commercially, this was supposed to be a market test. Can, within a market, and a pretty tough one, within a market, can you cover your costs, including the costs of, the overhead costs of running the business. And then for the things that came out most strongly in that second stage, the idea was that the larger amounts of money, we don't think randomized controlled trials by themselves are going to generate scale. It takes a whole bunch of adaptation and other work to get to scale. The idea is there's funding to transition things to scale, larger scale funding, but that's only for the most successful things at the earlier stage. You don't have, by the way, you don't have to get funding, you don't have to do the earlier stages with funding from us to get, if somebody else gets you to the stage where you've got evidence, you can apply for stage 6. And I should say, although I'm mainly giving this talk as an academic, we're on the web. If you think you have something relevant, please look us up and apply. So that's a brief description of the program. I'm going to look at our portfolio in the first couple of years for evidence on which innovations scaled. After 10 years, there's at least some chance of seeing that. Second, is this a good investment? There's a lot of immediate needs. USAID money could be going to address hunger problems today, for example, or health problems today. Does it really make sense to invest in this innovation? And third, are there implications for the design? I'll say a little bit more. So that's sort of the outline. I'm going to say, and if there is time, I might say a little bit. Oh, I didn't start the timing, so you're keeping time. Good. I'll say a little bit more about the nature of the program and how it differed in some ways from some other programs. So one thing was not by design, but when this program started, there's a lot of headcount restrictions in the federal government. And so there weren't many staff at all, extremely small staff at the beginning. And the U.S. government works under procurement rules, which are, set up for things like, if you get good government lawyers, there's actually quite a bit of flexibility. But, we were just starting. The standard rules are like, you're building a bridge. Can you can you talk to the bidders ahead of time about how to do this? No, that's like totally unfair. You're favoring one bidder over another. So there was very limited, so we're basically getting proposals and looking at them. It wasn't a lot of back and forth. Now, if you talk to people, if you talk to venture capitalists, most of them say that they add a lot of value. They go back and forth with the entrepreneur and they help them improve their ideas a lot. We couldn't do any of that for legal reasons. For a combination of the legal reasons and the very small staff. Things have evolved. We have a bigger staff. There's now appropriate legal procedures in place so that in case any of you are thinking of applying, you can apply. Once you get through an initial screen, then the competition is deemed to have taken place and you can have more conversations. But that was the rules during that part. So another thing is we're open across all these areas. So a very typical procedure for a lot of larger scale development funders is there's very heavy staff involvement, or for venture capitalists. I don't want to claim I really know this industry. Probably people here know it better than me. But often there's a member of the staff of the venture capital firm who sort of takes this on and proposes things and writes an investment memo up, which goes to the investment committee to make the decision. And a lot of the decisions are based on that investment memo as opposed to an application. We didn't have specialized staff who could do that type of thing. So we took the application and it went for some internal review. If it's a Kenya project, if it's a project in Kenya on solar energy, it'll go to the solar energy experts within USAID. It'll go to Kenya office within USAID. It'll go to outside experts on solar energy and maybe on Kenya. And then the decision gets made by people who know how to assess evidence and cost effectiveness. So more sort of, to some extent, finance type people, like actual venture capitalists, but heavy involvement of development economics researchers. So of academics, okay? Which is, and then how did we assess potential for scale? So I think venture capitalists, I'm told, put a lot of weight on the team. And I've been told actually by venture capitalists, like, good idea is useful because it attracts good people, and then if you've got good people, then you're able to pivot well to the actual thing, but you're not going to pursue I think they treat the idea sort of like, I don't know whether I'm allowed to say this, but like how an admissions committee for a PhD economics program would take the proposal for what people are going to study in the PhD program. Like, you're not really going to study that, but maybe we learn something about you that way. Okay, so but that wasn't that we were focused. We were judging on much more on the idea. So that was a little. So we were much more flexible in team composition. I mean, it's a plus if people had a track record of scaling, but it wasn't the core of it. We put a lot of weight on cost. If it's expensive, we thought it wasn't likely to scale, and we made some judgments about political acceptability, but that was not through any particularly rigorous process. For innovations that were designed to scale through the public sector, there was a whole separate set of funders for that. they often have rules that they want a separate implementer and a separate evaluator. They want to make sure that the government of the country is actually putting in money, so they've got skin in the game to indicate that they're really going to scale this up. We tended not to have those rules. So a lot of departures from standard approaches. Okay. I want to give a flavor. I'm not going to go through any of, through these in detail, but here are some examples. I've highlighted this one. I think it's a decent example of a social entrepreneurship idea for people who don't know this field. This was a proposal for a private company that would work on sanitation in urban slums. They'd put in the public toilets. They would charge something for them. They would then take the waste and turn it into fertilizer and into energy, and have a revenue stream from that. And they were aiming for a sustainable business out of this. Some of them were for-profit, some of them were non-profit, but there were also things that were much more. Here's one: Ghana National Apprenticeship Program Impact Evaluation. Those academic researchers doing evaluation of a government program. Okay, I'll skip this. Let me show you a first result. This is the number of direct beneficiaries as of May 2020. So we funded 43 things. As you'll know, this is an extremely skewed distribution. Skewed enough that as long as I was going to keep this scale linear, you can't fit it all on one chart. There's a little discontinuity symbol there. So most things did not reach that many users. 9 out of the 41 actually did, which I feel good about. I think that's pretty good relative to a lot of other funders in this area. I'll explain the difference between the red and the blue later, but you can ignore it for now. But the skewness, I think, is actually completely characteristic of funding innovation. If you're a venture capitalist, you know that most of your investments are not going to yield the bulk of your profits. You're hoping you invest in a Google or something like that, and then you're going to make real money. And so that affects how you need to analyze all these things. And that's why, as a bit of a preview, why I think the count methodology is not really one to focus on too much. The question is that right tail big enough? Okay? And does it have enough impact? If you're thinking about the social rate of return. Okay. Okay. Let me. Didn't get the slide to animate. That's too bad. Okay. So here's some data on which things scaled. So pretend that the last 3 columns are covered up. So there's a view that that pilots never scale. That's a sort of truism in the development world. And you can see that indeed the stage 3s were, by scale we mean reach over 1 million users. That's crude, but we did have a higher rate of scaling among the 1 data point of the stage 3 investment, but and a lower rate, much lower rate among the pilots. But if you now look at the right-hand columns, you'll see that because those grants were so much smaller, the cost per person reached actually looks quite good for the initial investments. And, so I don't want to overplay that because we only have one data point of a stage 3 investment. But you certainly wouldn't say, oh, pilot. You wouldn't. If you look at this on a cost number of people reached per dollar spent, I'm not suggesting that's a welfare metric, but you wouldn't say, oh, pilots look terrible here. Okay. Here's another piece of evidence on what scales. I will try to move to something closer to welfare. So first histogram shows the unit cost seems very important. So innovations that are less than $3, and we picked that cutoff exposed, and these are all univariate comparisons, 41 data points or 43, depending on how you count them. We can't be super sophisticated here. But there was a much higher rate of scaling among things that were really inexpensive. Okay? Second one, which I think is sort of a corollary, and I think is something that gets taught in business schools, although I need to, I need somebody can tell me whether it's true. I think a lot of entrepreneurs in general think about selling to ultimate, final consumers. But a lot of business is business to business or business to government. And if you think about you're selling a product that's less than $3, customer acquisition costs are going to be really big relative to everything else. So if you can find a way to sell your product or distribute your product to a large existing business or a government or maybe really large NGOs, that tends to be more successful. And then the final component, where I guess I have a particular conflict of interest to declare, is involvement of RCTs, and that's basically virtually collinear with involvement of researchers, is actually, there's a widespread feeling that this slows things down and that, it gets in the way of the nimbleness that entrepreneurs need. And those, by the way, are not arguments about welfare. Those are arguments about the ability to scale. But we see that, researcher involvement actually tends to be pretty positively correlated. Researcher involvement in RCTs is positively correlated with reaching over 1 million users. There obviously could be a lot of reasons for that. That could be selection, people who want to get an RCT done, know they have a good product, et cetera. I actually suspect, also knowing some of these cases, I'll show one, for example. This is the bottom one, psychometric credit assessment. So this was an idea. This was Asim Khwaja's had started an organization, a firm. I think it was a private firm actually that was using. They basically just asked people over mobile phones a bunch of questions to predict their credit worthiness, and then they sold that technique to microfinance or just regular banks. That's an example of taking an idea that came from research, but then so I would actually conjecture that part of this is because if you think about other fields in biotech, it's very common for graduate students to start computer science. I mean, Google was started by graduate students. I think economics is the image of economics is people who are doing algebra or paper and pen or analyzing data sets, but increasingly economists in a variety of fields are getting involved with doctors who are figuring out kidney exchange systems or auctions, or in the case of development economics, a bunch of programs in the field. And hence, I think we may be moving towards that in some areas of economics, where people actually are well placed to work as innovators. Okay, so those are some of the correlates. Okay. Now let me try and move to something that's getting at welfare. That's very hard for a number of reasons, but we care about this question of, are discounted benefits greater than the cost? So the benefits, number of people times the net benefits per person. So we're going to, one thing that the funders in this field typically do, or I'm sure all funders in all fields do this, is their annual report claims all the wins, but of course everybody wants to be funding the winners, so you might get a distorted picture from that. You might get double counted. So what we do is we try to look at the total funding that went to the organization, and then look at what share development innovation ventures accounted for, and and only count those benefits. That's very crude. Early investments should get more credit, and it requires some subjective assessments of things, and obviously doesn't get at the counterfactual. But at least we try to do that very basic step. Okay. Then how do you estimate the benefits? Okay, there's a bunch of conceptual issues, particularly because some of the things that we supported were very hard to, if it's a domestic violence reduction program, how do you put, or something to reduce voting fraud, how do you put a dollar value on that? We didn't even try. Health has a system which, is subject to lots of criticisms, but it's standard to use in health economics that sort of allows you to convert things to dollars, so we use that. There's also, innovations take time to scale. A key variable, how many people they reach in the future, but we don't know that. Okay, so what we tried to do was use this bounding approach. You can see these are non-academic slides because I put bounding in quotes, and histograms, etc. Okay, so so you can take advantage of the skewed distribution. You don't even need to worry about all the ones on the left tail, or they might play a small role. So we looked at the high scale innovations, and then we looked at which ones can we potentially quantify. And then, for that, some we couldn't for conceptual reasons, some we just didn't have the data. There was an RCT done, or there wasn't an RCT. If there wasn't an RCT done, if it's just, we can't always get at the benefits. If there was, but then the innovation changed a lot, and scaling, which is a good thing and a necessary thing, we still can't estimate the benefits. So I'll just go back to that slide. The ones in red are the ones where we quantified the benefits. So there are 5 where we could quantify the benefits. Okay. So, but then you got a cherry picking problem. You're focusing on these 5 that scaled, and well, we solved that by trying to get a bound. We set the benefits of these 5 against the cost of the full portfolio. Okay, so then you've got a lower bound. Okay. Let me show you a little bit about, now there are problems with bounds. You can't compare bounds. So you can't say this funder is better than that because their lower bound is greater than somebody else's lower bound. Thanks. Okay. So let me show an example. This is actually a social enterprise. There's a $430,000 investment by DIV. There's an RCT for tea pickers. It showed a 22% productivity increase. Not everybody's a tea picker. We cut that in half somewhat arbitrarily. So we assume 11% gain. 6.8 million glasses. The investment share was 5%. We calculate 31 million in benefits. Okay. Okay. When we add up across the 5, we spent 16 million on the whole portfolio. When we add up across the 5, we get a 200. When we focus on the lower number, we got a 260 million benefit, so a 17-to-1 benefit cost ratio. If we haven't updated this, if we projected that straight line, it'd be 180 million, and an additional 180 million. So even bigger gain, I think. 24, but that's, I think there's imprecision around all these numbers in the lower bounds anyway. The point is, it looks like it was a very high return. And, certainly better than 1-to-1, and looks in the range of some of these scientific R&D portfolios. Obviously, this is just one particular entity, and maybe we got some lucky draws at the beginning. Okay, this raises a question, why the positive social returns when private investors are presumably more nimble? And I think the hypothesis would be, or that I'll propose, is that commercial investors leave an arbitrage opportunity for socially minded investors when there's low ex-ante expected private returns, but high social returns. And we know something about that from economic theory about what those cases will be, and I alluded to that in the beginning of the talk. Low barriers to entry is one of them. I wrote potential customers in government. More generally, if the potential customer has monopsony power, then there might be underinvestment unless they can do it themselves. It might be even worse with the government because they can do things that other monopsony buyers might not be able to. Let me show you let me show you an example like that, actually. Sorry, I should have put this slide in multiple times. So the innovation that scaled the most, and again, this was a private firm. It's a US firm that produced software for community health workers. And they have a number of different clients, but among them was the government of India, which has, I think, 1 million community health workers. So you're serving a lot of mothers if you get this out to those community health workers. Well, India went with their product for a while, but then later they decided they were going to redo their contracting. They kept the basic idea, but they went with an Indian firm. Now, if you're a private investor, that's a disaster. If you're a socially minded investor and there's no barriers to entry, that's a plus. And and as long as the government of India, if there's no barriers to entry, so you wind up with lots of competitors, that's good. If it's this type of case where the government, there's a monopsony buyer and they go for someone else, well, as long as that other product is good, it's fine. If you think that other product isn't as good, there's some cost. But okay. Sorry, go forward. Okay, or cases where the customer doesn't obtain the full value of the product, the communicable disease intervention, environmental intervention, innovation. Okay. So, you can have this rough type of typology. So, there are going to be, I think sometimes people get the wrong idea. So, I think there are a lot of innovations. Most innovations are developed by the private sector for private markets, and that's typically great. Ride-hailing apps are useful for high-income countries, and then they're adopted in low-income countries, and that's presumably great. Although I know people have different views on that. But obviously areas where so this is access to social benefits, this is private profitability. There's some things that are privately profitable but might not be good socially. There's a ton of things, and I think this is sometimes why impact investing gets a bad name, it's this thing called play pumps, this idea that a children's merry-go-round, or children are going to push it, and that's going to pump water at the same time, got a lot of hype, got some public funding. But, pumping water is a lot of work. It's not exactly something that kids are going to do for fun. And it's a terrible failure, and both privately and socially. Okay. But if you said why, if you'd stop to say, well, why isn't the private sector doing that? Maybe you wouldn't have invested in that. But I think there are other things where the expected social benefit is positive, but the expected profitability is negative. So, strategies to reduce electoral fraud. There's a bunch of innovations on that. It's not clear you're going to make money from that. Or, so this is something I was involved in. Water treatment dispensers. But then you're giving away. Key part of that was giving away the product for free. Again, you're probably not going to make a lot of money doing that. There are other things. There might be this area. I'm not saying there's no purpose in business schools running these competitions for innovations that could, but some of those things they might be positive profitability once they're developed, but they're risky, and then that might be the case where it makes sense to invest. One, or at least a important case where it's important, where public sector subsidies for the innovation investment make sense. Okay. Okay, I think this has implications for design features. If I thought about, for feedback for I remember talking to a venture capitalist, and I was arguing to give feedback to the rejected applicants, and he thought I was totally crazy. A venture capitalist would never do that. It takes time, energy. You might get lawsuits. But if you're trying to, if some of these innovators are going to go on and do something, you've got peer reviews, you might as well give it to them. Why we relied very heavily on peer review rather than internal staff analysis. Well, there's some dangers of that if you're a venture capitalists do peer review as well, but there's some dangers. Somebody might get the idea. You don't want the idea to leak. Heavy involvement of researchers who are going to write up papers that communicate to the whole world about this. Well, that's not great from the standpoint of protecting the innovation, but it might be good socially. Support for early stage innovations. I argued that the pilots did pretty well. Well, but sure, the pilot might have done well in terms of scaling, but if you're a private investor, you want to pick the firm that is actually going to have the product that scales. You don't want the idea to do well. You want the particular firm to do well. So there's reason to invest at a somewhat later stage. And then openness across sectors. Obviously, this is conjecture, but if you're a very top venture capital firm, you can sign up who you want, the entrepreneurs you want. But if you're not at the top, then you have a real adverse selection problem. So it makes sense for you to specialize. We're working in a particular area within biotech, and we fund things there and then we employ the staff who can judge, proposals in that area of biotech. In our case, we could, because there aren't as many funders who are giving away money, I think we had less reason to worry about that adverse selection problem. It wasn't quite as bad for us. Okay, let me, there are other things I could talk about. Let me mention, I'm not going to talk about them, but let me just put them out there in case people do want to talk about them in Q&A. One is, I should say that France has set up an open tiered evidence-based social innovation fund called FID, which Esther Duflo and Pascaline Dupont are both involved in. I think there's it's different in some ways, but similar. I think there's with these high returns, I think there's a role for setting up similar funds in other contexts. This was in international development, but I think similar things could be done in climate, in other areas. I'm chairing a commission on innovation for climate change, food security, and agriculture. And this is not setting up a fund, but we've looked at a number of areas, and I think there's both a number of innovations that are ready to transition to scale and a bunch of earlier stage innovations that are worth support, which are not being, my subjective judgment is that these are not being pursued by the private sector enough because of gaps between the commercial incentives and the social value of this research. So happy to talk about that. And in the introduction, Laura mentioned the advanced market commitments, and we've got just launched a initiative on market shaping and to try to complement this sort of upfront funding approach to innovation with incentives that reward successful innovations, as in the advanced market commitment for pneumococcus vaccine. And I think that approach can also be useful, and happy to discuss that as well.
Thank you so much. It's on already? Okay, great. So I think we have about 18 minutes, and we'll take questions, and we'll use the mic. So if you have a question, you can raise your hand, and then I can come to you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Matthias Thiemann, Sciences Po Paris. Great work. I'm really happy to see this work. I wanted to ask, this seems to make a clear case for public venture funds. If you could expand on this, if this is where you would be willing to take this idea. Europeans are trying to go in this direction. And the second question that I would have is, how do you calculate, which you can't, but how do you approximate expected social benefits? Like, what's the way that you think about, so I agree with the intuition, right. It makes a lot of sense, but how could we go about establishing interdisubjectively the expected social benefits of an innovation? Thank you.
Right. So on the first part of the question, would it be useful for public research funders to use this approach? Yes, so I think it would be. I don't want to take away, to the extent that public research funders are focusing on basic research, I think that's really important, and I'm not suggesting, taking away money from that. But I guess I would take from this that not only that it's worth public research funds supporting this, but that, I'll give an example. In the U.S., and I don't know how this has worked out, I haven't seen the data from it, but the Department of Education established a program to support local initiatives that would try and do careful evaluations to come up with better ideas in education. And that's funded out of the education department. So I would support things like that. But sure, I'd also support it if we're not pulling away money from something else that's very high return, I'd support that for public research funders. And then in terms of how did we calculate it, so I gave you an example of how we calculate that ex post. Ex ante, that's tricky, but we certainly did not do that type of calculation at DIV. We didn't have the staff. But I think and only sort of realized some of this logic, ex post looking at the data. But I do think it's possible to say, private funders, Warren Buffett is famous for saying he wants to invest in things where there's a moat, where there's protection for the first entrant against, I think it's worth public research funders saying, well, we are not interested in a moat. In fact, a moat is a negative for us. And if we fund something with a moat, we might just be displacing private investment, and we're probably not contributing as much to social welfare. So I think those sorts of informal qualitative things could be done. Or we're looking for things that, reduce emissions because we think there's a clear market failure on top of the normal ones there.
Compare the bounds across funders, because that'd be very easy. That'd be useful if one could, compare different funds.
Yeah, So first, just logically, if we have a lower bound, but we don't know the upper bound, then the fact that funder A has a higher lower bound than funder B doesn't mean that A has a higher return than lower B. So that's the logical reason. I'd also add to that, there's a bunch of assumptions that go here, and we tried to be really conservative in part because we knew we could, and we'd still get our message across. But in some ways we were too conservative. I guess for another funder, I think the question should be: is their lower bound above 1 or 1.2 or 1.4 or whatever you think the relevant marginal cost of funding is? Not whether the French. I have no idea whether the French initiative will wind up higher or lower than this, but I don't think that. We shouldn't be worried about that.
I have a question, and you may have addressed this, and I may have missed it particularly in your graph. It's about how you're thinking about scalability. So, right, we know this is very important, scalability when you're doing startups and VC work. But a lot of this socially beneficial type of activities, and I've been looking at impact investment with a bunch of people over the years, is that it's is this limit on the scalability of the services or the type of assistance or benefit that they're trying to get. It could be scalable at some point, but it depends really on this call it an intermediary organization, or the ability, these organizational principles that they're trying, because they need very specific relationships or information. Think of micro-lending to a certain degree. And then there's this problem, though, of getting it to a size where outsiders will say, okay, now we can ride that. And I don't know how you've thought about that problem.
Yeah, I wonder whether, I don't know, but I wonder whether one other hypothesis for why the randomized trials were associated with scaling was, obviously, consumers aren't going to pay any attention to a randomized trial, but ultimate final consumers. But the intermediary organizations, like a government or even a large business, there was one thing that scaled, which was trying approach to reducing accidents in minibuses, and they got the private insurance companies to adopt this because they showed them some evidence. So I think I think there might be a role for evidence creation there. But we didn't, here's what I am a little bit, a lot of these ideas were pretty far-fetched when they started, and a lot of them failed, right? So I would hate to make a requirement for that the large organization has to put in money to do this, because one person within the large organization might have authority to say, yeah, we will do this experiment, and we'll try out this idea. But they don't necessarily have authority to sign the contract for a big study or to put the money into it. So that's where I think these things do generate a social benefit beyond that one organization, because ideally these could be used in many countries. So I think it's worth. I would argue it's worth taking some risks and not asking for very, very heavy requirements for the intermediary organization. It's obviously a plus. An application where shows the intermediary organization is taking this idea seriously and is putting in money, much stronger application. But we don't require that, and I think that's for a very early stage thing, and I think that's appropriate. Yeah.
We're on this side of the room now. We've got a question here.
Thanks. This is really fascinating. When I try to step back from some of the examples and put them back in their context, insofar as I understand their context, which is very limited, I wind up with a whole host of other questions. So just to give you an example, if I understand your tea pickers example correctly, it strikes me that not only is the social return high, the private return is high. 22% is a pretty big increase in productivity. What's the market failure preventing people from buying glasses or investing in glasses when they will buy scissors or portable harvesters or what have you?
Yeah, I don't know. And I think that's a really interesting question in its own right. So this organization, they originally wanted to sell in the private market to ultimate consumers. And actually, they're classified this way. We classified them by ex-ante proposal. But that market didn't work. I think I have to conjecture it's some sort of behavioral issue where people don't realize how bad their eyesight is because it comes, it deteriorates gradually. So they now sell to firms that, a firm that runs a tea plantation, and they're willing to do this. But I don't know. It's a great question. Behavioral is my best guess.
Back over here.
I was wondering about differences across different types of innovations and different types of industries. So when I saw this, I almost fell backwards because it seems like it's like climate change, food security, and agriculture. It's like so big. And then I'm wondering whether what you learn from one of these parts actually always translates into another one, and how are the differences across those areas?
Yeah, our sample size is too small to cut it up, unfortunately. I do think there is a theme of innovations in public service delivery. I think there's probably a pretty severe underinvestment in that area.
You mentioned that the returns on investments are very, over here. You mentioned that the return on investment is very skewed. I'm wondering, can you get a confidence interval on the portfolio return?
We haven't done that. I don't know how to get an upper bound. Here's why, just logically, we couldn't get an upper bound. Everything's going to depend on what happens in the future. Are we going to get Are these innovations going to go from where they are to 100 million or 500 million people? Then the return will be astronomical. But it's too early to tell after a decade. I mean, maybe not in the tech sector, things scale very quickly, but in most innovations take decades.
Hi, I had a question about your the rightmost project that was about software for community health workers.
Yeah.
So this was just out of curiosity, out of all the applications that you saw, because the VC model in tech the softwares have this capacity of reaching a lot of people with very low investment. So the market failures might be preventing public benefit software from being developed. So my question is, in the applications, like, did you see more of those projects, and if those failed, like, why would they fail? Or if you didn't see many software applications, why not? What's your hypothesis of?
So I will note that I'm really excited about the potential of software to improve public services. This was a decade ago, so pre-large language models, but there were still, and maybe, well, there was some work on digital agriculture that seems to be going somewhere. I think digital is an exciting area. I can't give you a breakdown of the return to digital versus non-digital.
In your sample, like, did you see any applications of that kind in the initial round?
Oh, we certainly get lots of applications for digital things, but I don't know, relative to, I don't know whether we funded too much or too little or whatever. But
any other questions? Let's see. I don't see any hands, but there's one. Okay, great.
Thanks so much. I thought the discussion around the prior RCT and how that affected the success was very interesting. I'm curious. I know the sample size is small, so this might have to be a qualitative answer. But if I was to ask the question, there's a experimental or quasi-experimental study that was done before, and do those quasi-experimental studies also predict success, or a very well done meta-analysis? So I'm trying to understand, if there's not a prior RCT, in your experience or either in the data, probably the former, what are ways that seem to suggest that it'll be successful?
Well, I think cost is a big predictor, and I think whether you're selling to, my guess is that if we took those out of the sample, so first, I don't think there's anything special about RCTs. If somebody has a great regression discontinuity design, fantastic. I doubt, we don't have the data, can't say it with these 43 data points that include zero well-identified regression discontinuity designs. But my conjecture would be, that would also be associated with scaling. And I think my guess is that the other predictors will still work, even outside the RCT context.
Maybe I might get the last question. So this idea that governments can invest in stuff that has a high social return, low private return, is very compelling. What governments are not so good at doing is recovering from perceived failures. So the play pumps is it's not as famous, but Solyndra, whatever, these things that. And so I'm wondering how you can insulate the public investment institution from that kind of pressure that would enable them to take the sort of risk that would give the right. You could get the right tails, but you're going to have a bunch of failures, which might be politically difficult to manage.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So I'll give two answers to that. One, for some reason, that problem has turned out for us to be less of a problem than I would have guessed. I mean, I've shown that graph various places, and before the decade, being 12 years old doesn't seem very long, but there were Republican supporters of this, strong Republican supporters of this. I don't know whether there still are, but I think somebody from Romney's campaign, it sounds like ancient history now, but was very excited about this, for example. But let me give another answer to this plug the final thing that I wanted to plug. Another approach is to set up things that only pay out if they succeed, and then rely on the private sector to work out the financing. So let me plug I talked, the pneumococcal vaccine advanced market commitment was discussed earlier. So this was a commitment to buy a vaccine if one was developed for the strains of pneumococcus that affect low-income countries. But let me give a climate example. So cement, concrete, that accounts for 7% of emissions. The chemical process when you make cement releases a lot of greenhouse gases. Okay? The U.S. government procures about 50% of the cement in the United States, 49%. So imagine the U.S. government just said, the U.S. government also has a social cost of carbon, which is now about $50, but they're going to raise it to $190, or at least, that's the plan. And cement costs about, the social cost of making cement is in the same order of magnitude. So you would, now the U.S. has the social cost of carbon. It theoretically uses that when it decides whether to build a bridge or not, or a highway. But in the procurement, that isn't actually factored in. Imagine the government announced procurement rules. And I learned about this, actually. Sorry for the slightly long-winded answer. But I learned about this when I took my required training course as a government employee, which I am part-time because of DIV, and learned about, for some reason, I had to take a training course on how to procure software. I don't know why. But that included something saying that I have to pay attention to, or the focus of the training course was procuring software for people with disabilities. And the government has a set of rules for that. It has to be accessible. And it also has to be the best available, some clause like that, which you can get out of under only extreme conditions. And you should, the video told me, don't even try, okay? So, and the government explicitly does that. One of the rationales for that policy was to generate innovation to make more accessible software. Okay? Well, maybe economists don't want this sort of legalistic with no dollar signs in there. But in the case of carbon, we've got a price. We've got $190. So imagine that the government just announced when we evaluate bids we're going to take into account not just the price, we look at the price of the concrete we're not going to just look at the bid, but we're going to add in $190 per ton of carbon, and you have to get evaluated for what you're doing. Well, there's a bunch of technologies for lower carbon production in cement manufacturing, ranging from putting in some additives, which I think might be a 30% reduction, to using an entirely different process, which would be 98% reduction. So that's an example where if, we know we've got, global warming isn't controversial at all. So since we've got consensus on that, we can, but there's some countries where it's not controversial. So if there's consensus on that, then you could have a policy saying, hey, we're not making the bet on which technology is going to work. We know that some will work, some won't. We'll let the private sector sort that out. But we promise if you create the clean cement that's certified by some certifying body, then you can factor that into, we'll factor that into your bids. And that could create a market for this type of innovation.
Thank you. I think we have to end there. So thank you again to Michael for the session.